So we are continuing our discussions on COVID. Unfortunately, even though we thought that we would sort of be able to move on from that, but yes, we have Dr. Nidhi with us, who would be discussing the immunity generated by Omicron, and this is a topic that I believe that we all are a little concerned about, because there's a lot of hullabaloo about the boosters and whether the vaccination is really needed. So without much ado, I would call upon Dr. Nidhi Dhawan, the Secretary of IMA DMA and the Associate Medical Director of ENT and the Head of the Safety Committee in Shroff Charity Eye Hospital in Daryaganj, to take over the meeting and enlighten us further on this much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Meenakshi. You exactly put your finger on the point that we need to address. The fact that there's a lot of conflicting information available about Omicron, about vaccination, and about the rest of the things that go with it. So I think we'll take this. Here. So, I will also address that CBC that we have received on our group in a little bit. So, understanding Omicron, both in terms of what the virus does and what is the status of immunity and the need for vaccination going forward. So, as usual, if we talk about the daily new confirmed cases, let's look at India staying right there at the bottom. This is per million people with the highest population. And this is Israel with the lowest population and the highest vaccination rate. Vaccination in Israel has been largely mRNA vaccination. Vaccination in UK has been largely the AstraZeneca, the viral vector vaccine. And in the US, again, it has been largely mRNA vaccine. In our countries, it has been a mix of both the complete inactivated virus as well as the viral vector vaccine. If you look at the effective reproduction rate as of July 2nd, you see that UK has the highest, Israel 1.2, India 1.17, US 1.13. All countries are staying marginally above 1, which means that the virus is not completely gone. When Omicron was peaking, we were at nearly 3. Israel was inching higher than 2. US and UK were at a 1.5 and a 1.1. Despite that, if you see September, July, somewhere here would be January. If you look at what it was at the time of Delta, when we had the highest number of cases, we were at a 1.5, US at a 0.9, UK at a 0.8, Israel at a 0.6. This was the time when we had, a little after this, when we had hit our highest number of cases in a single day, which was 400,000. And we got a lot of flack from the world press. And then when the rest of the countries hit nearly 2.5 times that value, everybody conveniently kept quiet about what was happening in the world. This is a very good parameter to see if we are testing enough. So we keep hearing that India is not testing enough. Re-looking at it, US and UK have stopped even putting out figures. As of 18th of June, India needs to conduct about 39, 38 tests to get their first positive. Israel has to conduct about 3 to 4 tests to hit their first positive. Still a very high rate of positivity in Israel. As of 15th of June, this was 39. US was getting about 7.5 negative tests to the first positive, and Israel was at about 3.5. Looking at what's happening to the cases. Over the last week, if you observe, the new cases are kind of, staying somewhere in the range of 16,000 to 18,000, a little here or a little there. The 7-day average is slightly rising, but again, staying more or less constant, which is what we see here. The graph is slightly flat. It is not showing the steep rise that we saw with Omicron. We still could be in this part of the curve that was before Delta, but we still have to wait for about 15 days to confirm whether that is really the case. The UK, on the other hand, is showing a very sawtooth-like graph, and the graph is definitely showing an uptrend. The trend is going up not only for the number of cases, but also for the number of deaths. And we have examined why this could be so, but we'll come to it in a bit. US, again, is following the same pattern that India is following, but at a higher baseline. So while we are in, 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 bracket, they are in the 100,000, 120,000, 125,000 bracket, with a population which is comparable to the population of Uttar Pradesh, I might add. Deaths are not significantly going up, which is encouraging, but are staying in 3 figures, unlike what we are seeing in India. Looking at what the world vaccination status looks like right now, about 67% of the world population has received at least 1 dose of a COVID-19 vaccine. About 12.14 billion doses have been administered globally, and 5.5 are administered every day. But despite these high numbers, we find that only about 20% of the people in low-income countries have received at least 1 dose. Looking at that, what is the situation? If you look at the first map, that is the map of the vaccine doses administered per 100 people as of 7th of July. If you look at the second map, that is the map of the number of new cases confirmed per million as of 7th of July. You could actually literally superimpose these maps. The more highly vaccinated countries are also the more highly afflicted countries. Now, that may not be a story about the vaccine. It may just be a story about the population. But it is something that is worth looking at in a little greater depth. There could be other factors that come into play with this kind of a thing. Australia, largely mRNA vaccine. US, largely mRNA vaccine. Canada, largely mRNA vaccine. UK, largely AstraZeneca vaccine. China, Sinopharm. China, we don't know what's happening here, right? Now, if Sinopharm is working, then Bharat Biotech is also working because they are a similar platform. But Africa, largely unvaccinated, Africa, largely unafflicted. You could say that we are not doing enough testing over there, but the people are not falling enough sick over there also. We have seen the progress of variants from Alpha to Omicron having skipped Nu and Epsilon, but we will examine what is happening with Omicron. Now, this is where Omicron seems to have emerged as a standalone variant, if you look at the Delta variant, most of the Omicron mutations are in the receptor binding domain and the receptor binding motif. These tend to both increase the affinity of the virus to bind to cells and also increase the stability of the bond. There is a slightly improved binding stability, but there is a substantially increased binding affinity. This is largely attributable to these three mutations: the T478K, the Q493K, and the Q498R. The Omicron has a slightly different symptom profile, with runny nose, according to the Zoe symptom app, being the highest. Headache is significantly present, as is fatigue, as is sneezing, as is sore throat. We've seen all of these. Now, all of these are also the features of a somewhat severe head cold that you could get with a rhinovirus. Rhinovirus is another coronavirus which has been present with the human beings for centuries and millennia. If you want to compare what happens between Omicron, Delta, and other viral illnesses, fatigue is common in all, headache is common in all, runny nose is common in both Omicron and Delta, but with others, it may or may not happen. Sore throat common in both. Sneezing is a feature which has been added to Omicron. Chills, high-grade fever, persistent cough. My experience was that persistent cough was coming, but the Zoe tracker says that persistent cough is not so common. The chills and fever, shivers, not so common. Fever, not so common. Brain fog, not so common. Muscle pain, loss of smell, chest pain, not common. These are all uncommon features. So we all know, the symptom tracker that Zoe has been following, and how good of work they are doing in tracking what is happening with the pandemic. This is a study which talks about prevalence, duration, and risk of hospital admission in individuals affected with SARS-CoV-2 during Omicron, comparing it with Delta. This is also from the Zoe study. So several studies from South Africa seemed to indicate that infection with Omicron variant was slightly less severe than with the previous dominant variants and had significantly lower rates of hospital admission. This was the premise that this study started with. The Mediterranean study from France, the IHU Mediterranean infection, investigated the first 1,119 Omicron cases in France and reported again significantly lower rates of hospitalization, need for intensive care, or even mortality compared to more than 3,000 Delta cases that they saw. This study is largely kind of in tandem with what we saw earlier, because it is based on the Zoe app. So if you look at this circle, headache is the most common. If you look at runny nose, it is pretty common. Sore throat, very common. Sneezing, hoarseness of voice and some cough, loss of appetite. Now, these are the ones which are very rare. Burning skin, hair loss, blistering of feet. These are the ones which are less common. The light blue is Delta, the dark blue is Omicron. Irregular heartbeat. Kind of same with both Delta or Omicron, which means POTS could be common with both. So the symptoms are largely upper respiratory symptoms with largely maintained lower respiratory and systemic health. It is interesting that if we look at Omicron, you see that the disease could last up to 20 days in combined matched cohorts. But this is an overall thing. You look at 2 doses of the vaccine, that's your primary vaccination, and you find that Omicron kind of finishes within the week, around 4.5 to 6 days. Delta, despite 2 doses of vaccine, can carry on for the same duration of about 3 weeks. You look at 3 doses of the vaccine, it further shortens the duration of disease to about 5 days. This is the active portion of the spike which attaches to the ACE receptor. You find that most of the mutations have happened in the same region for Omicron. There are 43 amino acid mutations in the spike protein and 34 residues in more than 60% of available sequences. So the active site of the spike protein is being altered, which changes the antigenic character of the site as well as the binding affinity. So the mutations in the Omicron receptor binding domain distort the epitopes for not only the antibodies that the body produces for its own protection, but also the therapeutic monoclonal antibodies, which are largely escaped by Omicron. Coming to, and this was published on the 1st of June, so this is pretty recent. This takes into account all the variants from Omicron also. So we are going to discuss the virology, the immunopathogenesis, and the lab diagnosis of Omicron and the way forward. Should we be scared? Is it a matter of concern? Is the virus becoming endemic? And as it is becoming endemic, is it really becoming mild, or is it still something that we have to be apprehensive of? The brief summary. If you look at the lineage, Delta had a B1.617 lineage, whereas Omicron had a B1.1.529 lineage. The origin of Delta, well, the first few cases were discovered in India, and the first few cases over here were discovered in South Africa. The subvariants, there was one AY4.2, but in Omicron, we are seeing accelerated subvariant generation, and now we have even reached a 4 and a 5. The total mutations here, there was a mutation jump here too. There were more than 13 mutations, and of which 9 were in the spike protein. There are more than 50 mutations, 62 or 63 to be more exact, of which 36 to 39 were in the spike protein. The transmissibility of Delta had increased. It was about 25% more transmissible than the ancestral strain, but the infectivity, transmissibility of Omicron was way higher. It was even 35% to 50% higher than Delta. Infectiousness, both of them are comparable. Reinfection rate, there was a big query on Delta that if you have had previous infection, Delta would not be a threat. But in Omicron, the reinfection rates are pretty high. This we are talking about this particular review. They have given references at the end of the review. Mortality with Delta was very, very, very high. We have seen tragedies of unspeakable magnitude unfold in Delta times. Whereas in Omicron, it is nowhere near what we had in Delta. Pediatric infections were uncommon in Delta. Pediatric infections are fairly common in Omicron. This might be actually working in our favor. Vaccine efficacy, it was very high with Delta, but it is questionable with Omicron. So what really is the immunopathogenesis? Where does the innate immunity, the hyperimmune response, and either a resolution or a progression to long COVID really happen? Now, there is something called the immune shift. The SARS-CoV-2 has been from the ancestral strain up till Omicron using the ACE2 receptor to infiltrate the cells. But there is another slower and less efficient pathway, that less efficient for the previous variants, that Omicron has started utilizing. The ACE2 is a ubiquitous receptor. It's present on endothelium, it is present on alveolar cells, macrophages, neutrophils, and other immune cells. And so all these cells can potentially be infected by the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And it results with its initiation in the production of IL-6, interferon gamma, and monocyte chemoattractant protein 1. The important thing is that the IL-6 seems to turn the immune switch and cause a sort of Th1, Th17 imbalance. So the lymphocytic response in any viral illness is important, but especially so in COVID. We find that just for a brief review of what really happens in viral illnesses, the cellular immunity kicks in, whereby the CD4 helper T cells, the CD8 cytotoxic T cells, and memory B cells are activated to eliminate both the infected cells, to generate antibodies against the components of the virus detected in the body as foreign, and to create a memory for the future. Now, when this response is educated, controlled, nuanced, appropriate, several words what you could use for it, then the disease resolves. If, however, the body fails to recognize the foreign antigens are present on critical cells, the complement is activated, the immune response is out of proportion to the stimulus, then there is what we call the cytokine release syndrome, or the CRS, which is marked by the release and increased production of TNF alpha, IL-1, IL-6, 12, 18, 33, interferons 1 and 2, and even the CCL family, as we discussed, that happens, in HIV also. The immune response is characterized by, and this is where your जो हमारे group पर वो CBC आया, that's something that is important. The immune response is characterized by leukocytosis and lymphopenia and a high NLR. In fact, this inversion is the first sign of immunological shift. This is a hyperimmune, uncontrolled response which increases inflammation, which causes immune exhaustion, and increased risk of triggered inflammation and thrombosis. The raised cytokines, the lymphocyte overactivity, causes progressively increasing immune malfunction, which exhausts the lymphocytes both in terms of function as well as in numbers, and also the trapping of the immune cells in the neutrophilic extracellular traps, the NEToses. Now, these NETs are formed by neutrophils which have engulfed the virus, by the thrombocytes, by the RBCs, and these form aggregates. The sluggish circulation, the sluggish immune response, the increased thrombosis, and the decreased immune capability at this time results in multi-organ failure. Now, is IL-6 really the trigger? What does IL-6 do? Now, IL-6 is the main cytokine that is released from the infected cells as they sense the foreign particles. When IL-6 is upregulated, if you look at the antigen presenting cells, the IL-6 receptor works through the JAK-STAT pathway to increase IL-4. IL-4 drives the antigenic cellular response from predominantly Th1 to predominantly Th2. So Th2 rises. Th2 is largely pro-inflammatory. The Th2 response, having risen, puts itself into a self-looped stimulation, and there is more and more and more Th2 available. The interferon gamma is suppressed by this response. This is the first thing that happens with IL-6, that a Th1, Th2 imbalance is created. The second thing that happens is that it preserves the cells, reducing cytolysis. Now, with reduced cytolysis, there is also again a looped self-stimulation to allow for persistence of antigen and a rising IL-12. Also, there is reduced apoptosis. So there is a persistence of infection in the infected cell, which causes increasing Th17 polarization and increasing availability of an antigenic inflammatory stimulus in the body. IL-6 has its role in almost every system of the body. In the liver, it causes rising CRP, rising fibrinogen, rising serum amyloid, hepcidin. It decreases albumin. So while CRP is the first to respond and the quickest to fall, another important parameter could be the albumin fibrinogen ratio. If albumin is less and fibrinogen is more, then the body is in a pro-inflammatory state. If you are able to reverse this ratio, recovery has started. It works on the hematopoietic and the megakaryocytic stem cells in the bone marrow to cause decreased platelet production, as well as relative anemia, slowing down hematopoiesis, osteoclasts so that it weakens the bones, synovial fibroblasts so that it causes joint pains, works on the lymphoid cells, the angiogenesis, the mesangial cells in the kidney, the keratinocytes in the skin and the hair. So it affects all the systems. And we have seen that it causes a predominantly Th17 response, which promotes chronic inflammation and autoimmunity. In the presence of Th17 autoimmune favored response, the B cells are also working towards antibody production, which is more in favor of autoimmunity. IL-6 has been implicated in kidney disease, it has been implicated in rheumatoid arthritis, it has been implicated in cancers, it has been implicated in almost all diseases that have an inflammatory basis. This study says that the old paradigm that IL-6 simply enhances the Th17 response and suppresses Tregs is false. There is evidence that IL-6 classic signaling induces Th17. So it's not just that it enhances pre-existing Th17, it induces a Th17 response. At the same time, ROR gamma Tregs are also suppressed, are also enhanced, so that there is immunosuppression. So if there was a good target for clinical resolution of disease, IL-6 would be one. We've gone through this many times, but still, if IL-6 and TGF-beta are present, the response is largely Th17. If IL-12 is present, the response is largely Th1. And if IL-4 is present, the response is largely Th2. The Th2 response results in antibody production, neutralization and trapping of pathogens, and elimination of disease. This is the most favorable response. If Th1 is present, it activates macrophages through interferon gamma. Again, required, but this is something that can go a little out of control and result in local tissue damage. But it is the Th17 response which recruits inflammatory cells like neutrophils for elimination of intracellular pathogens. But as it goes out of control, as it causes suppression of T regulator cells, there may be persistence of antigenic stimulus and persistence of inflammation. So in SARS-CoV-2, we have seen that the first response with IL-1, IL-10, TNF-alpha causes monocyte stimulation. The monocytes cause IL-6 formation, which work on the JAK-STAT pathway and result in increased inflammation. In terms of the lymphocytic response, this is increasing Th17, increased CD8 cells, which are cytotoxic cells, increased plasma cell, and decreased T regulator cells. What is important is that also IL-6 directly affects the endothelium and causes increased VEGF, increased monocyte stimulating, colony stimulating factor 1, increased IL-6 by a self-regulating loop, increased IL-8, and decreased cathedrin. This leads to increasing vascular permeability, monocyte and neutrophil recruitment, vascular leakage, signal amplification, formation of NETs, sequestration of RBCs, sequestration of thrombocytes, so that there are aggregates that form and make the circulation even more sluggish. The direct effect of IL-6 on the liver increases CRP, ferritin, hepcidin, decreases albumin, increases fibrinogen, and also results in escalation of the complement pathway. So in short, IL-6 can be sourced from a lot of tissues, and it has its effects on a lot of tissues. It seems to be like that final common pathway in terms of molecular biology for body's inflammation. IL-6 does have some anti-inflammatory and protective activity. It is not a complete villain. The classical signaling with activation of GP130, which leads to intestinal epithelial cell proliferation, inhibition of epithelial apoptosis, and IL-6 dependent regeneration of liver and pancreas. The acute phase hepatic reaction, which allows the body to recover from an acute abuse, and a relative defense against bacterial infection. So this is the good part of IL-6 classical signaling. However, if the trans signaling comes into play and there is increased pro-inflammatory IL-6 activity, then there is recruitment of mononuclear cells, recruitment of stimulation of endothelium, stimulation of smooth muscle, inhibition of T cell apoptosis, and inhibition of T cell differentiation with persisting inflammation. Interestingly, this is not just happening in COVID. Even in tuberculosis, there is decreased IL-6 expression on CD4 cells in persistent active tuberculosis. A lot of features then are common when there is acute phase and when there is IL-1. TNF alpha contributes both positively and negatively to control mycobacterial infection. Patients with lung cavities have higher percentage of polymorpho nucleosides in bronchoalveolar lavage and decreased IL-6. Coming back to COVID, we know this diagram from times immemorial, 2 years now, 3 years. So stage 1 is an asymptomatic stage where innate immunity will be activated, where virus will engage with pathogen associated molecular pattern receptors, and there will be a type 1 interferon response. And the next stage is that of not very severe symptomatic disease, in which the adaptive immune system begins to kick in. There is generation of specific antibodies, there is activation of the T cell response, and there is a release of damage associated molecular patterns, which then can trigger the cytokine release syndrome, resulting in the severe respiratory multi-organ inflammatory thrombotic state of COVID, which is driven by IL-1, IL-6, TNF alpha, GM-CSF, interferon gamma, which has coagulopathy and complement activation. The cytokine response seems to be the switch for people who are going to go downhill, and the viral load at that time is not the culprit for the disease. It is our own body fighting the virus, which has gone out of control, that kills the host. So what is the right time to start aggressive anti-inflammatory or anticoagulant therapy? The time to start aggressive therapy would be in this state. When it already reaches stage 3 is where, and that's what sir used to say, jaldi shuru karo, so that those complications do not happen. All this has been very true for most of the COVID-19 cases. But is it as true for Omicron is what we have to examine. So we know that, if there is a balanced Th1, Th2 response, when there is adequate antiviral cytotoxic response, then there is resolution and there is also antibody formation. However, if there is an imbalance with the Th1, Th17 axis, which results in decreased or depleted Th2 T regulator cells, then there is uncontrolled inflammation, cytokine storm, and multi-organ failure or death. The timeline has typically been, about 5 days of incubation, about 10 days of mild phase disease, and days to weeks of severe disease and recovery. Some people go into long COVID and even in recovery will not have complete recovery. It takes long time to recover fully. The various treatment protocols, whether with antivirals, interferons, HCQS, or with IL-6 blockers, IL-1 blockers, or even steroids, have tried to limit the inflammatory response and suppress the viral load. So what is really important is the appropriate versus inappropriate immune response. What is really important is the immune shift or the immune exhaustion that derives the disease spiral. Now, the first thing that happens is an uncontrolled innate response. The second trigger is the diminished adaptive response. This immune dysregulation damages the lymphocytes, especially the T cells, activates the macrophages, and activates the cytokine cascade. The T cells that are critical in this are the killer cells, which should eliminate the infected host cells, which are unable to do so, and the helper cells, which induce B cell activation and antibody formation, which are unable to do so. So this is a direct quote from the paper. The immune neutralization of SARS-CoV-2 requires a good, robust cytotoxic T cell response, which depends on individual genetics and does not need antibodies. And all we are doing for vaccination is find out antibodies kitni hai. The cellular immune response in specifically Omicron. Omicron has been found to be 10 times more transmissible, questionable, but okay, and show twice the ability to escape vaccines compared to Delta. Omicron is a very fast, efficient, and effective virus. Why it is so is because it not only uses the ACE2 receptor, but it also uses the endocytosis. It uses the TMP-RSS to its benefit. The T cell response, the cellular immune response, is very robust, it is very long lasting, and is not measured or measurable by antibody titers in the body. It does evoke memory, and with every fresh infection will be triggered to produce fresh antibodies, but is not measured by circulating antibodies. In fact, in the first 2 weeks after vaccination, the immune response is slightly blunted as the body is assimilating the immune education. The T cell activity is found to be retained in most infected and vaccinated individuals. ये मैं नहीं कह रही, ये वाला पेपर कह रहा है. Novel method of infecting cells that Omicron uses has made it more efficient for upper airways and unable to infect lung tissue. This is similar to previous human coronaviruses like the rhinovirus, the common cold virus. The Omicron replication is diminished in cells overexpressing TMP RSS, but boosted in cells showing endosomal entry. So it can use either pathway. It can use pathway that uses ACE2, or it can use pathway that uses endosomal entry. This significantly increases its cellular targets. So it is able to infect a lot of cells in the upper airway. But it has lost the ability to cause cell fusion and also lost the ability to infect the lung tissue, because most of it gets mopped up in the upper airways. Now, what is of concern is perhaps that it has multi-species ACE2 binding ability. Particularly, this paper says that mice and fowl may be able to mop up the circulating SARS-CoV-2 Omicron variant, which brings about the possibility of an animal reservoir. Now, doubling times of the three variants of concern, the Beta, the Delta, and the Omicron, have progressively shortened. At the Beta, it was nearly 2 days, 1.7 days to double the number of cases in the community. In Delta, it reduced to 1.5 days. In Omicron, it reduced further to 1.2 days. There is an increased rate of reinfection with Omicron. We are talking about simply positivity, not severe disease. There is a decreased rate of long COVID. We examined this data in the last week talk, that in Delta times, it was nearly 40%, and in Omicron times, it is less than 10%. In Omicron, there are 50 mutations, 32 of which are on spike protein. Of note is that it picked up the common cold immune signature. The rate of mutation also has accelerated. Not only does it have more mutations, it is more rapidly mutating even from that stem. The vaccine efficacy was 9% protection for BA1, 13% for BA2. 9% protection for BA1, 13% for BA2. This is important. Now, there are more than 60 insertions or deletions, the variant with most mutated area of all previous variants. So the subvariants that are of concern are BA1, 1.1, 2, 3, 2.12, 2.12.1, but now even BA4 and 5. The BA2 was apparently 33% higher rate of transmissibility, with 40% chance of turning positive if a family member has BA2. Whereas there was about a 30% chance of turning positive if a family member has the BA1. The disease, however, is not more severe, is not causing more hospitalization, is not causing more damage. About 13.5% of individuals with BA2 spread it to their families. Now, with BA4 and 5, it shares a mutation from Delta. The L452R mutation from Delta is present on BA4 and 5. Does this make it more dangerous? Or does it offer cross immunity to people who have been previously infected by Delta? That is the important question to answer. The spike mutation profile of BA4 and BA5 is, so mostly it is in this receptor binding domain. Part of it is at the N-terminal domain. The mutations Q498R, S371L, T478K increase affinity but lower fusion capacity. That means it can affect cells which express ACE2 but cannot cause damage in the cells by causing lysis of their cell membranes. The T478, the N440K and the N501Y increase infectivity and perhaps help in escaping immune memory. Most of the mutations of concern are in this area. So if you look at this is B1, 1.1.7, 1.351, 1.617, and BA.1. So if you see the number of mutations here, these are the ones which are of concern. See, this one had what? 1 everywhere, maybe 2 at the N-terminal domain. So look at this. This one has the maximum number of mutations. So this paper says, and again, this is a direct quote from the paper, Omicron diminished vaccine efficacy against infection to 33% from 80% that was present for Delta. That means vaccines protected 80% against Delta, but only 33% against Omicron. Moreover, the effectiveness of Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine against severe disease and hospitalization reduced from 93% to 70%. The individuals infected with Delta had a 40% relative risk of getting Omicron. In contrast, those infected with Beta had a 60% likelihood of reinfection with Omicron. Now remember, Delta was a later variant, Beta was a previous variant. So the duration from the primary infection seems to have a role in what is the risk for reinfection. Since the Omicron infection has been recorded in people administered with J&J, Pfizer-BioNTech, and AstraZeneca vaccines, it can be concluded that Omicron cannot be prevented using standard 2-dose mRNA vaccine dosing schedule. However, the Pfizer vaccine was reported to improve SARS-CoV-2 neutralization. What they mean is that severe disease is less common. So severe disease protection with AstraZeneca is proposed at 71% with a reinfection rate of 33%. Johnson & Johnson only 57%. But look at the difference. So the various subvariants, BA1 and BA1.1, increased transmissibility, increased global dominance, quickly ran over. Additional mutations, deletions in S protein, reinfection rate, severity. So all this was kind of increased over Delta. But look at what is happening with BA2 and BA3. The BA2 variant was at least 3 times more severe in terms of transmissibility, in terms of infectivity, in terms of number of additional mutations and global dominance than BA1. But is simply the presence of mutations and presence of virus in the community an indicator? So should we be counting numbers now? An indicator of where attention should go? Is it an indicator of what is happening to the human host? Now, this is a very interesting study done by a New York, Qatar collaboration. Duration of immune protection of SARS-CoV-2 natural infection against reinfection in Qatar. This study particularly studied protection offered in unvaccinated individuals. Protection of pre-Omicron primary infection against pre-Omicron reinfection. That means if there was any infection from the Wuhan Alpha, Beta, or Delta, Did it offer protection against reinfection? This is pre-Omicron. They say that a natural infection in unvaccinated individuals offered an approximately 85% protection. The vaccine offered about 84 to 95% protection. The effectiveness peaked in the 7th month after primary infection to 95%, and then began to wane to about 70% by 16th month. Now, if they did a statistical analysis using the Gompertz curve extrapolation, they predict, this is not actual observed, this is a predicted waning effective protection of about 50% at 22 months and less than 10% at 32 months. This is from pre-Omicron primary infection to pre-Omicron variants leading up to Delta. Now, what is so we know that this is comparable or better than vaccine protection. Protection of pre-Omicron primary infection against Omicron infection. This, they said, was about 38% and showed a decline with increasing time from primary infection. Ye bhi humne dekha in the last. Now, Gompertz curve projection made it less than 10% by 15th month. We saw vaccine efficacy also having dropped to 10% after 15th month. Now, this is, can you become positive? Can you get infected with Omicron? The vaccine and the first infection, primary infection, are comparable. Now look at what is the effective protection against severe, critical, or fatal reinfection. They are categorical in saying that this is a 97.3% protection in previously unvaccinated people. The protection is similar irrespective of age. It is same for people more than 50 years of age, which is not the same in vaccines, by the way. हम कह रहे हैं कि more than 50 years को revaccinate करने की जरूरत है क्योंकि vaccine efficacy wane कर रही है उन लोगों में. This last statement is a direct quote from the paper. Protection against severe reinfection remains very strong with no evidence of waning irrespective of variant for over 14 months after primary infection during the period of study. Now, if previous infection per se is offering that kind of protection in unvaccinated individuals, what is the vaccine doing to these people? Any form of previous immunity, whether induced by previous infection or vaccination, is associated with strong and durable protection against COVID-19 related hospitalization and death. There is no evidence for a difference in severity between BA1 and BA2 infections in the study samples in our study. And I'll bring you back to the California, New York study that CDC published late in 2021. This is the start of the Delta variant. If you look, there is no previous diagnosis of COVID-19, but this is the highest number of cases where the person is unvaccinated, uninfected. But look at unvaccinated with previous COVID-19 diagnosis. You see this little light blue line? This is the level of protection from here to here is the zone of protection for previously unvaccinated, naturally infected people. This is not to say that natural infection is the way out. It is simply to say, if you got the natural infection, the immunity that you gained is robust, at least comparable to, perhaps better than, vaccine-induced immunity. These are the people who were vaccinated but had no previous diagnosis of COVID-19. They are still at a marginally higher risk than those who have been infected. The best, however, are those who have been vaccinated and who have been previously infected. ये सब data है in the open. It's all there for us to examine. So the time is to be careful, not fearful. The time is to examine all available information and to follow science and logic. Boosting every 6 months is not the answer. I would say that if you have comorbidities, if there are administrative reasons to boost, आपको फॉरेन ट्रैवल करना है और आप उस बूस्टर के बिना जा ही नहीं सकते, आपको एंट्री नहीं मिल रही, जो कि अब नहीं है. I mean, most of Europe has dropped vaccine requirements. They're asking for a COVID-19 negative report. They're not asking for vaccine reports. So we should be moving towards a logically driven, individualized prescription for vaccination rather than a public health blanket mandate for vaccination now. Vaccines do work. But the emergency use authorization that mandated vaccination for entire populations, that time is over. We all have immune memory. We are talking about seroprevalence rates approaching 100% in most populations, including Africa, where we have not seen severe disease, deaths and hospitalizations. And I know this is very provocative, but I think no studies on COVAX in Poonam, mein, unfortunately.
इंडिया में कोई कुछ नहीं करेगा.
नहीं, हम लोग करें क्या? हम इतने बिजी हैं 4 लाख लोगों को डील करने के लिए कि हम 10 लाख वालों से हार जाते हैं.
और पता है, मैंने ना बूस्टर लगवा लिया. अनफॉर्चुनेटली जस्ट बिफोर यू सेड देयर इज नो नीड टू गेट द बूस्टर.
नहीं, वो लगवा लिया, कोई बात नहीं. आप अब
UK,
डेनमार्क, ब्रिटेन, US ट्रैवल कर सकते हो. But I'm saying it's not offering any additional.
Yeah, and I felt so much of malaise after that. I was almost unwell for 6 days.
So I feel like boosting.
So I've told at least my family not to get themselves vaccinated after suffering.
I would say that vaccination has to be individualized.
Yeah.
Also, in my opinion, personal protection during times of rising incidence is more important than vaccination during rising incidence, because vaccination के time पर आप immune education वाली window में ज़्यादा susceptible हो.
बिल्कुल बिल्कुल.
तो अगर आप वो 1 हफ्ता निकाल सकते हो तो आप रुक जाओ.
हाँ, ठीक बात है. अच्छा, मैंने अपने पेरेंट्स को भी नहीं वैक्सीनेट कराया बूस्टर से.
मैंने भी नहीं कराया.
They are 86, 87.
नहीं, मैंने भी नहीं कराया.
No need.
हाँ, no need. At least that is what I feel. Meenakshi will tell me what she feels.
नहीं, because problem क्या है, वहां जाके infection पकड़ लाएंगे.
That is one. Second is, what is the benefit that the booster is offering? We've seen in these reports that the booster is not significantly offering any great advantage.
Because अब Omicron तो वो बिल्कुल ही mutation वाले हो गए, तो फिर फायदा क्या?
नहीं, और Omicron, fortunately, having picked up the common cold immune sequence,
Ah.
will continue to infect, continue to evolve, and continue to cause some disease.
Right.
It is acting like a live booster.
Right, right.
मीनाक्षी कुछ नहीं बोल रही है, मेरे को डर लग रहा है कि अभी वो क्या बोलने वाली है.
No, not at all. I think we've been talking about it for almost 2 to 3 weeks now, and you've just fortified our beliefs about how COVID-19 is something that we really should stop fretting about. You like very brilliantly you've depicted it in all your research about how the inflammatory phase is something that we are not having to deal with, and thus the need to fret automatically sort of goes away. And then we've just been fortifying this, that the booster is just something that needs to be individualized. Everyone, just like hypertension, the treatment is individualized. It's not just
Right.
everyone gets
Right.
it. So that the booster, if it's actually required, and Dr. Nidhi said that if you have comorbidities, but I honestly don't think that even if you have diabetes, if you have hypertension, you need to go for the booster unless they are uncontrolled. So if it is controlled hypertension, controlled diabetes, I honestly wouldn't. Dr. Poonam just said that she had 6 days of malaise when she took the vaccine, and that is pretty much all you're getting, even if you're getting the infection.
Yeah.
Right.
So
I mean, last week only she talked about कि नहीं लगवाने का कोई फायदा नहीं है, and I had already got it, and I realized कि my God, I'm suffering so much.
पहले भी हम बोल रहे थे, Dr. Nidhi was also in concern with us, but it's just we were trying to be a little subtle about it, but we decided to sort of be a little bolder maybe last week.
Illness में ना actually जब आपको पता लगता है आपके घर के नीचे ही लग रही है और आराम से लग रही है, तो आपको लगता है चलो let's get it done. That's what I think.
And now there is talk about fourth boosters, and there is talk about
I know it's endless.
It is endless, and it is not needed.
Yeah, and so many of our friends who are in the US and UK, they are all talking about the fourth dose which they've already got, and it's going on and on.
The patients even come to us. There are some patients from who maybe travel to the US and they've gotten their boosters there. Indian residents, and they come so proudly. They say, "हमने 4 vaccine लगा लिए, लेकिन अभी हमें COVID हो गया है, हम क्या करें?" So it's
no point.
There is no point. I mean, even the people who've just gotten 2 vaccines, they are also showing a similar clinical picture. There are very few patients who are actually, the worst that is happening is that people are having fever for a longer duration and a higher grade fever for longer duration. That is my experience, is that there's nothing that is happening beyond that. And even that gets resolved by day 7. That is within the time frame of the viral replicative phase.
And also, as Dr. Sanjeev is pointing out, that children are complaining of symptoms after vaccination, and children are also picking up Omicron, which is not being, it's not resulting in that multi-system inflammatory disorder. It is not resulting in any inflammatory outcomes of concern. We should be individualizing medicine now. वो crisis वाला emergency वाला phase is over. We should be talking about being doctors rather than, let the epidemiologists and the public health people continue to give guidelines, not mandates. Now, mandates ka time is over.
My question is, Dr. Manisha here, can you hear me?
Ji, ma'am. Yeah.
That the vaccines are not being tweaked as they should be. Like influenza, keeps pace with the new variants and etc. But over here, why vaccine manufacturers are lagging behind?
क्योंकि उन्होंने बहुत सारी बना के रखी हुई है, वो कौन लेगा?
वो चक्कर है तो बड़ा मुश्किल।
एक तो वो कौन लेगा, दूसरा दूसरा जब तक वो ओमिक्रॉन की बनाएंगे तब तक ओमिक्रॉन, सो
वेरिएंट आ जाएगा।
so there is not only has Omicron produced more mutations, but also it has an accelerated rate of mutating. So the subvariants of Omicron are almost like a new virus.
They are not able to keep pace, you mean?
They will not be able to keep pace with it. This is just a big pharma money making whatever, but
I avoided booster till June. May beginning I avoided, but when I saw my daughter and son-in-law getting a second Omicron infection, I got a bit rattled and I went and took a booster, the precaution dose. Otherwise, I was holding on with my Omicron in Jan, and with that belief and confidence. But then I lost.
मैम जब हम
and I took
90
one.
जब हम कहते हैं 97% प्रोटेक्शन, तो भी 3% को तो हो ही सकता है.
Correct. And 2, 3,
और वो 3%
every day, even now.
नहीं, but they are
Right.
not dying of COVID. They are not dying of COVID.
But
They
COVID can be a trigger.
Yeah, they are dying with COVID. So mix of vaccines, there are numerous studies which say that boosting with a mix produces a better immune response than not mixing them. However, मैं तो अब क्वेश्चन कर रही हूँ कि वैक्सीन कर क्या रही है.
करना भी नहीं चाहिए बेकार में, जब तक they are tweaking with the new variants. Otherwise, no use.
I have a question, Dr. Nidhi.
जी मैम.
You know my daughter's case. She got COVID, severe COVID in January 22.
जी मैम.
So she's exposed to patients. देखती है OPD देखती है रोज. तो वो should she go for booster?
Ma'am, I would say that again, it has to be a very individual and very targeted call you take. मैं अभी भी कभी मुझे लगता है कि मैं एक्सपोज हुई हूँ तो मैं अपनी आइवरमेक्टिन और HCQS की डोज ले लेती हूँ. अब मैं उसको वीकली और मंथली भी नहीं ले रही. मतलब now I'm not even
HCQ for other reasons.
No, so that's what I'm saying कि अगर मुझे लगता है कि मैं एक्सपोज हुई हूँ तो मैं ले लेती हूँ. I did get Omicron in January. Till then, I was dodging the bullet. Ever since, I have seen a lot of patients who could be COVID positive. Now people are honestly not even getting tested because क्या है, बुखार है, 5 दिन में खत्म हो जाएगा.
3 दिन में भी.
3 दिन में भी खत्म हो जाएगा. गले में दर्द होता है, बहुत दर्द होता है.
हाँ.
तो वो ENT के पास इसलिए आते हैं ये सोच के कि ये टॉन्सिलाइटिस है, और टॉन्सिल होते नहीं है, फेरेंजाइटिस होता है. So I would say that अगर आपको लगता है कि उनको बूस्ट करने की जरूरत है तो it has to be a very individual decision. That's one. Second, अगर आपको बूस्टर लेना भी है तो राइजिंग कर्व में मत लीजिएगा, क्योंकि जब आप राइजिंग कर्व में लेते हैं तो मीन्स के जब कम्युनिटी में केसेस आर इंक्रीजिंग, at that time आपको अपनी हर एक इम्यून सेल चाहिए, और जब आप वैक्सीन लेंगे तो आपका इम्यून सिस्टम वैक्सीन को असिमिलेट करने में बिजी हो जाता है. तो फॉर द फर्स्ट वीक और 10 days आफ्टर वैक्सीनेशन देयर इज अ डिप इन योर इम्यूनिटी.
Okay, when it is there in the community, then we should wait.
नहीं, when it is there in the community नहीं, when the cases are rising in the community.
Yes.
When you feel it is flattened, when you feel like the number of cases are not rising exponentially, when you feel like you can do with a little bit less immunity for a couple of weeks, that's when you should boost, if at all you have to boost. Okay. Otherwise, boosting, in my opinion, has no great advantage.
Okay, thanks.
So I think quite a few valid points, reiterating it for almost 3 to 4 weeks now. I think we've we've established that the need for booster has to be very individualized, it has to be very targeted. We all have to be very well aware of the fact that there is no vaccine that is providing sterilizing immunity against COVID, and that infection hone se sirf, I guess, mask रोक सकता है. Now whether the mask is a mandate or not, that is still that we are not debating. But yes, the need for boosters, that is something that needs to be individualized. I don't think there should be any mandates. Dr. Nidhi did mention that if there are any administrative reasons because of which you do need to take the booster, then you can go ahead. But again, we are challenging the administrative need for the boosters as well. So thank you, Dr.
Say if
Nidhi,
a person like, sorry for interrupting, Meenakshi. If a person like Djokovic can forgo the Australian Open because he will not be vaccinated.
Yes.
That's a choice we choose to make. अगर मेरे लिए यूरोप जाना ज्यादा जरूरी है तो मैं वैक्सीनेट हो जाऊंगी. अगर मैं कह सकती हूँ कि मुझे नहीं जाना, I am so that's a choice I make. So that's what I'm saying now.
Absolutely. So he chose to, he believed that the vaccine would affect his performance.
Yes.
And he refused to go for the vaccine, and even forgo the as she said, he gave up the
Australian Open.
Australian Open altogether. So that was, again, so I think that we should all be given this choice, irrespective of where we want to travel. Thank you, Dr. Nidhi, for taking up these very, very pertinent topics every week with us. And a big thank you to all of you for joining in and keeping this show alive. We'll be back again next week. Until then.